Hillary and Clinton unveiling a bold plan today to deal with a rampant gun violence, and it doesn't need approval, she says, from the Republican-led Congress. We'll tell you all about that. Also, a one-on-one conversation with a Democratic congressman who's got a lot to say. Then we'll talk about how the gun issue is impacting the presidential race. Will it wind up being a winner or a loser if Democrats really push hard? Then another high-level resignation in the wake of BRIDGEGATE. We're going to tell you Governor Christie's reaction. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Well, a few days after yet another mass shooting, Hillary Clinton unveiled her gun control plan at a New Hampshire town hall meeting this morning.
We need universal background checks. We know that they will work. We need to close what's called the Charleston loophole. The young man who killed the 9 people in the church in Charleston. There's a loophole in the Brady bill that if you go to try to get a gun and they don't finish the background check in 3 days, you can get the gun. They were still trying to find out about this young man. It turns out he did have a criminal record. We need to close the gun show loophole. You know, I think it's 40% or so of the gun sales in America are done online. They're done in gun shows. They're done by people selling out of the back of their cars, basically.
Now, Hillary went on to say that if Congress won't pass any of these things, she'd want them done by executive order. Well, earlier today, I spoke with Democratic New York Congressman representing the Hudson Valley, Sean Patrick Maloney. Before I get into the different policy pushes, both for national candidates as well as even some New Yorkers, your reaction, like many of ours, I'm sure was visceral when you saw the tragedy in Oregon. It's also, I would assume, predictable, some of the range of emotions we go through. Do you have any sense that this time will be any different, or as the president said, you know, we're just going to basically rinse and repeat? A month from now, some other spot, who knows where in this country, another gun tragedy is going to happen with another mass shooting, and we'll just wring our hands. Do you have any belief that we can actually do something about it, or is it we're in this intractable spot?
Look, I don't think people should be fatalistic or discouraged about this. Yes, our reaction is always not again, but of course we know we're not doing anything, so it's not that surprising that the dynamic in our society that creates these horrific episodes repeats itself. But there are things we can do that have nothing to do with the Second Amendment, that have broad bipartisan support, and that will make the most impact on these specific types of mass casualty shootings. For example, if we just close the background check loophole at gun shows, if we close what's called the Charleston loophole, where you get your gun after 3 days if the background check isn't fully finished, that happened in Charleston, in that terrible shooting. If we do things like a federal trafficking law so that you can't have straw purchases, one guy buying it who's okay giving it to somebody who's not. And we must keep dangerous weapons out of the hands of people who are violent offenders, either criminals, domestic abusers, whether they're married or not, by the way, and we must track mentally ill people better. We have to understand mental illness better, and we must keep dangerous weapons out of those that are dangerously mentally ill, which accounts for a great percentage of the mass shooting events.
I want to play a clip. This is what Governor Cuomo said, actually, in his eulogy, in part, to his aide that was lost in another senseless shooting. This, the governor, from just a week ago.
If the far right is willing to shut down the government because they don't get a tax cut for the rich, then our people should have the same resolve and threaten to shut down the government if they don't get a real gun control law to stop the killing of their innocents.
Do you think Democrats are willing to go to that end? We'll talk in a little bit what Hillary Clinton had to say, but is this just a political loser on a national level? Because no matter what Democrats say, they're going to be labeled as a slippery slope trying to eradicate the Second Amendment. I understand what you're saying. The vast majority of Americans support a universal background check. The vast majority of NRA members support a universal background check. But we saw that as part and parcel of post-Newtown fail as well. Should Democrats be willing to go to the wall for this, or with a major election year next year, could this see a lot of them on the unemployment line if they push too hard on this?
We must be smart about it, and I do not think, an emotional response aside, I do not think that that Democrats should get involved in this shutting down the government stuff, because it doesn't work. It ultimately doesn't work. It doesn't work for the guys in the Tea Party that keep threatening it for one thing or the other. Won't work for us. What we need to do is work across party lines. People like Pete King in New York, a Republican, who's good on this issue, and many other Republicans who believe we can take these steps, and we can do a lot of good, and we don't have to get anywhere near the Second Amendment. We don't have to have that fight. We don't have to, because people have a right to own guns in this country. The Supreme Court has told us twice, particularly for self-defense in their own homes. Military-style weapons, that's another issue. We can have that conversation too, and we should. But for goodness sake, in a bipartisan way, without this shutting down the government stuff, we can get these things done. We came very close after Newtown, and we just have to keep at it. And people have to
Did it not pass,
get involved.
Congressman, because there was too many other things, assault weapons bans, ammo clips? Is that the reason it didn't get through, or at the end of the day it was the NRA, either you're with me or you're against me, and Republicans couldn't make that leap?
There is some of that. The NRA has been absolutely just terrible and irresponsible about this, because they won't have any reasonable conversation about this. Every other interest group in Washington, by the way, no matter how powerful, will sit at the table and say, okay, here's what we want to protect, here's where we could give something up. The NRA won't do that. It's outrageous. We can do background checks. We can keep violent criminals, domestic abusers, mentally ill people, people on terrorist watch lists, for goodness sakes, today can go to a gun show and buy a weapon without a background check. That is not the Second Amendment to the Constitution. That is madness, and it would save thousands of lives if we just did those things. So the NRA should get on board with that. But whether they do or not, if people listening have had enough, they need to get involved. This has to come from the citizens.
Some of the things you mentioned at the top of the interview, we heard candidate Clinton mention earlier today in New Hampshire. But what the Secretary also mentioned, I'm curious what you think, is that the President right now, if she were President, she would take executive order and push through background check, et cetera, not go through Congress, but do this with a movement of a pen in the Oval Office. Secondly, she also said that no longer would there be an exemption for gun manufacturers or gun dealers here, where they wouldn't face civil liabilities if, in fact, their guns were used in commissions of crime, mass shootings, et cetera. What do you think about those two things?
I think they're very promising ideas. They're two separate things. What she's talking about there is in the last decade under the Bush administration, the gun companies were successful in getting really broad-based protection from all types of litigation. That's gone way too far. You're not going to sue them every time somebody does something wrong, but there are instances where they should have a concern about their own liability, and gun dealers are not inspected the way they should be, and bad actors who are breaking the laws that are already on the books need to be punished. We can do a much better job there. And the issue of accountability is very important. I think it is outrageous that somebody is buying guns for that kid in Oregon, knowing this is a deeply disturbed person who is now amassing a large cache of weapons. That means there's a parent that's making a terrible decision. There's a dealer who is making a terrible decision. And where they are knowingly and wrongfully engaging in that, we need to come down on that much harder.
And just finally on that executive order aspect, does the President have any President that authority, and are you comfortable the President doing that without going through Congress?
What she's talking about there is broadening the definition of who's in business as a gun dealer. I'm intrigued by that. I think it's interesting. But we should remember, these executive actions that push the outer boundaries of legislation are important sometimes when Congress is so gridlocked, but it's not a substitute for having a good law.
Well, let's hope. All right, and I wish you the best of luck on this
Thank
in
you.
Washington. Thank you so much, Congressman.
My pleasure.
Now, Hillary Clinton obviously talking about gun control in the campaign trail. Republicans like Ted Cruz, they're glorifying guns by shooting a machine gun and using it to sizzle bacon. You can't make this up. Which approach will resonate with voters more? Well, the political debate is coming up straight ahead.
There's grease coming down. All right, let's see if we've got some bacon. All right.